Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those joining us from the West Coast. My name is Sierra DeCrosta. I'm Israel Policy Forum's Manager of Programs and Partnerships. We're really excited to bring you the next installment of our elections webinar series in partnership with the Union for Reform Judaism. The road to this election was marked by a confrontation between secular right-wing politician Avigdor Lieberman and Israel's ultra-Orthodox parties, and questions of religion and state are sure to figure into this upcoming election. To help illuminate some of these issues, we're lucky to be joined by Rabbi Gilad Kariv, the president and CEO of the Israeli Reform Movement and a candidate for Knesset on the Democratic Union list. Just a quick disclaimer, Israel Policy Forum and URJ do not endorse any individual political party or candidate. But with that, I'd like to hand it over to our moderator, Rabbi Josh Weinberg. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to our friends at the Israel Policy Forum for partnering on this very rich and informative series leading up to the Israeli elections. I am Rabbi Josh Weinberg, the Vice President for Israel and Reform Zionism of the URJ, and I'm really delighted to be joined with, I would say, my friend, teacher, and mentor and Rabbi Gilad Kariv, who comes to us having now joined the Democratic Union list on the very prominent spot of number 11. So on a personal note, I want to wish you Mazal Tov and Behatzlacha, and lots of good luck and success in that. And I want to iterate that on an official note that we obviously don't endorse any candidates, and neither does your movement, the Israel Movement for Reform and Progressive Judaism. And I'm glad that you're joining us really as an expert on all things having to do with religion and state. In addition to living and breathing that on a daily basis, you also teach this subject to rabbinical students and to lecture widely on it around the world. And so we're glad to have your expertise with us. I want to move right in and start from the most recent events, and we'll have a chance also to go through some of the main issues that we look at when we discuss issues of religion and state in the state of Israel. And of course, I want to remind our audience today that questions are welcome, and you can put questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom program, or you can chat them to us. I want to also remind everyone that this session is being recorded and that it will be made available after we finish. So let's talk, Rav Kariv, tell us a little bit about how the end of last election sort of crumbled and where the issue of religion, the issue of Jewish observance in Judaism played a prominent role in the failure to be able to put together a coalition a few months ago, which now led to new elections.
So first of all, shalom to all of you, and I want to thank both the URJ and the Israeli Policy Forum for inviting me to share with you my observations and the way we understand the current campaign. Thank you for your good wishes. It is important to mention that also the Israeli Reform Movement is not a partisan body, and our movement does not endorse specific parties or candidates, and yet we work very hard in order to cultivate the political activism of our congregants, our followers, and we try to educate them that one of the ways to influence the Israeli reality is to become more and more politically involved. I'm glad to say that we have devoted members of our movement that are involved in the different Israeli parties on the left side of the political map, but also on the right side of the political map. Perspective, the best reality we can work to create is to have a strong and a positive Jewish progressive voice in the different Israeli parties. Now, in regard to your question, it's important to say that the coming elections came as a big surprise to the vast majority of Israeli politicians and, of course, Israeli citizens. And basically, people would have been suggested few months ago that we will go again to vote, and that Prime Minister Netanyahu fails in building a coalition, people would have rejected this option. And the truth must be said that the results of the last election that took place this last March basically enabled Prime Minister Netanyahu to form a right-wing government based on the support of the ultra-Orthodox parties. And Avigdor Lieberman's decision not to join the right-wing ultra-Orthodox party was definitely a surprise. And it is interesting to identify the fact that when Avigdor Lieberman had to justify his political move, and when Avigdor Lieberman had to present an ideological political agenda for his decision not to join Prime Minister Netanyahu, it was totally based on issues of religion and state, and the growing tension between the demands of the ultra-Orthodox parties and the desire of most Israelis to promote religious pluralism. And it leads me to say that usually governments in Israel are not being formed on the basis of the issue of religion and state. And we know it for many, many years that usually other concerns are the base for the establishment of the Israeli coalitions. Yet, it is important to identify the fact that Israeli governments fall because of the issue of religion and state. And that many times in the political history of Israel, issues that are connected to this stressing arena of religion and state relations in Israel, those issues are the issues that push us back to the polls. And it happened again. And basically, Israel is being called into new elections because of the issue of religion and state, and the fact that Avigdor Lieberman identified that the Russian-speaking Israeli audience and other communities in Israel are feeling that it is time to create change in this important arena.
Yeah, I agree with you. And of course, we generally see Israelis vote on security issues first, and then, of course, economic issues, and religion and state doesn't usually make it into a critical issue. In the polls, we've seen some parties, across the history of the past couple of decades, like the Shinui party that won, a big representation on a specific secular platform, and we're seeing some others campaign for that. But so you think it'll play a much more prominent role in the elections coming up as well, and will be a key issue that voters are looking at?
In the coming. Again, I'm not suggesting that this is the leading topic in the current elections. It looks as if the issue of the personal status of Prime Minister Netanyahu, the desire or the lack of desire to create a personal change of leadership, this is still the main leading issue. Yet, it is important to say that we already identify in the current campaign that the issue of religion and state in its wider capacity, it's not only the specific issues that we will address in our talk, the issue of Shabbat in the public domain, the issue of conversion, holy places, the status of the non-Orthodox streams. Those are the traditional core issues of religion and state, and definitely they are playing a role in the current campaign, but we see, maybe for the first time, that the Israeli public identify the link between those issues and the bigger issues around the democratic mechanisms of the state of Israel, the delicate balance between the Jewish character and the democratic character of the state of Israel, the growing tension between the Jewish majority and the Arab minority. And I think that for the first time in the political history of Israel, people understand that the issue of religion and state is part of a bigger debate in the Israeli public around the core values of the state of Israel. And when a person like Avigdor Lieberman is saying that he will work out in order to form a liberal national unity government, this statement presents a new political vocabulary in Israel. And people need to understand that, yes, we know that politicians say a lot of things in order to be elected. But to hear Avigdor Lieberman talks about the need to create a liberal government, it tells you something about the agenda of those coming elections. And one of the things we need to ask ourselves, how we use this opportunity in the best way in order to promote religious pluralism and tolerance in Israel.
Yes, I would say that in addition to some of the firsts that you've mentioned that we're seeing in this campaign, hearing the words Avigdor Lieberman and liberal in the same sentence is also something new. But so on the one hand, it seems like, yes, this is an opportunity to use religion and state for political opportunism, but also that this is the continuation of the same conversation that has been going on since the founding of the Zionist enterprise. If we think back between Theodor Herzl and Achad Ha'am and Berdichevsky and Brenner and some of these conversations about what is it going to look like to be Jewish in the Jewish state. And I'd like if you would be willing to take us a little bit across the political map and speak about, let's look at where the right wing is right now. We have a new union of right-wing parties. There was some discussion about who they would be led by. Some people were against them being led by a secular woman. And say where they are a little bit in terms of the place of religion and the place of Jewish law in the state, and then we'll move from there center and leftwards.
So I will suggest something, and as you justly shared with the audience, I belong right now to a specific list of candidates, and when I address the developments, the ideological developments in the other political camp, people should bear in mind that I'm also speaking as a candidate in the Democratic Union, but I'll try to do my best in order to present an objective analysis. And one of the things I would like to suggest is that in recent years, we did see a promising process that brought also right-wing politicians from the Likud, but also from the modern Orthodox party that was called in the past Amavdal and then Abayit HaYehudi.
National Religion Party, right?
Yes, we did see the first signs of a promising process that even in the right-wing Israeli parties, there is a growing understanding that we need to create some changes in this landscape of religion and state in Israel, and that we need to revisit the known status quo that was designed by Ben-Gurion and his partners. And let me remind you all the courageous act of Naftali Bennett, for example, that came and visited to visit a conservative school in New York, and when he was accused by the ultra-Orthodox parties, he presented a strong pluralistic agenda. I will even suggest that Prime Minister Netanyahu desired to enter the negotiations around the issue of the Kotel, and his first statements about the need to support the work of the non-Orthodox streams in Israel, those messages were sincere, and they reflected this growing understanding among right-wing politicians in Israel that it is time to create some changes in the way Israel understands its Jewish nature. But unfortunately, and this is the concerning development, in the last 2 to 3 years, and it is well reflected in the current campaign, we see that those voices becoming weaker and weaker, and in a way, this promising process was blocked, and we do see the emerge of a more extreme ultra-Orthodox and ultra-nationalist philosophies that are controlling the discourse in those parties. And unfortunately, right now, the leading political figures that are designing the discourse in the United Right-Wing list, and even inside the Likud, are those that want to preserve the current status quo, the current structure of religion and state. And in that regard, we experience a challenging moment. Unfortunately, the more liberal voices in the Israeli right are not leading right now the political discourse in this camp. And one of the ways to understand Avigdor Lieberman's move was to identify this vacuum and to present himself as the defender of a liberal, right-wing, nationalist, Zionist philosophy that is committed to the ideals of freedom of religion. And the presence of the influence of political figures like Bezalel Smotrich, who is now the head of the National Union, one of the parties that came together to form the new right-wing list. When we see his philosophy, and only yesterday he was quoted that their ultimate desire is to have Medinat Halacha, a state which is founded on the basis of the traditional Jewish law.
Governed by Jewish law, yeah.
Yes, those are right now the leading voices inside the ultra-Orthodox parties and also in the right-wing party. And Avigdor Lieberman is trying to balance it. And the entire right-wing discourse that yes, we can move slowly towards a more pluralistic reality of civil marriage in Israel, of public transportation on Shabbat, of building new relations with the non-Orthodox streams, this discourse right now in the Likud party and in the other natural partners of the Likud, unfortunately, this discourse is now blocked, and we hope that Avigdor Lieberman's move will re-energize this more, let's say, liberal discourse also in the right wing camp.
Yeah, thank you, and I appreciate that analysis. And let's just take a couple minutes to move across the political spectrum before we actually delve into the specific issues. Say something about the left, where traditionally the Labor Party and the Meretz parties have sort of not been entirely anti-religious, and that there were openly identified religious members of the party. I'm thinking of, Avram Burg was a, Orthodox Labor Party member, in the late 90s. and others, the fact that now that on the conglomeration of the Democratic Union between some Labor Partyites and Meretz and Ehud Barak, that they would bring in a Reform rabbi who is openly, who is campaigning as a rabbi. What is that saying for them and their openness to religion and their desire to be part of the change of the current status quo and the current system? If I can ask you the challenging task of speaking objectively about yourself.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely a challenging task, even for a rabbi. Look, I think that there is today a growing understanding among the central left Zionist parties that the issue of religion and state is a core item in our platforms. And issues and philosophies and political goals that for years were presented only by Meretz, for example, are today widely shared by Kahol Lavan, the central party, blue and white, led by Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid, are also shared by Labor and, of course, by the new party of the Democratic Union, which is based on Meretz, the party of Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, and a group of people that left Labor, led by MK Stav Shafir. And following what I just said about the new voices that are leading the right-wing camp, I hears that for many years were only part of the Meretz platform are today, as I said, are adopted by central players in our camp. When it comes to the Democratic Union, to the list that I joined, first of all, it's important to mention the fact that aside to myself, of the Green Party that joined the Democratic Union is married to a rabbinical student of the Israeli, and together with us, we also have Yaya Pink, who is a modern Orthodox a candidate, and it's very interesting to see that in our left-wing party, truly all Jewish groups, denominations, communities are represented. Secular Israelis, traditional Israelis, conservative Jews, Reform Jews, modern Orthodox Jews, and I need to say that even from a personal perspective, the way I was welcomed by the members of Meretz, the activists of the joint Democratic Union list was extremely moving. For me, it was another proof that our movement in Israel, together with our colleagues and friends in the conservative movement, we are becoming to be a known players in the Israeli political and public scene. And it is clear to our secular partners in the party that when we are talking about religion and state relations, it's not only about pushing back the religious legislation, it's also about cultivating a much more diverse, pluralistic Jewish culture in Israel. And I think our challenge will be to make sure that those items on our agenda and on others' agendas will be part of the coalition negotiation after September 17th, and that we will be able to promote our goals and not only to leave them as campaign slogans.
Yeah. Well, that is definitely a fascinating trend in terms of a societal trend that we're seeing in sort of that openness. I'd like to move into the issues, and I just want to remind everyone that the questions are available and open. I'm seeing a couple of questions come into the Q&A section, and we'll be happy to get to them in just a few minutes. I want to move on to talk about some of the specific issues that we're seeing. In my short list, I identified just about 6 or 7 critical issues that I think will be very, very divisive, and that, of course, the reform movement is fighting and the conservative movement is fighting very, very hard to advance. The issues that I'm looking at are specifically the issues of marriage and divorce and conversion, issues of personal status, the issue of public observance of Judaism, specifically the issue of Shabbat, which we know almost brought down the government less than a year ago, the issues of the draft to the army of the Haredi population, and of course the issue of the Kotel and other holy places and what place and who should be administering those issues. I'm not even getting to some smaller but not less significant issues like the issues of public mikvaot or public funding for religious institutions by the government. And if I had to pick one place to start, let's start with Shabbat, actually. I think it's an issue that affects every single person in the country. And that is a very, very divisive issue, especially with the ultra-Orthodox parties and the leaders of those parties, the rabbinic leadership, I'd say, who aren't in the Knesset, but definitely call the shots. How do we see that playing out in the coming weeks leading up to the election? I'm speaking specifically about transportation on Shabbat and even such things as construction on Shabbat, whether it's the light rail or it's a pedestrian bridge over the highway, things that have made the news in a major way, and that I think reflect a growing trend of a huge conflict when it comes to those issues. What should we watch for, do you think?
So first of all, I'll start by saying that definitely those issues, mainly of public transportation on Shabbat, will be an integral part of the campaign, and it will be presented in a strong manner, both by Avigdor Lieberman and also by the Democratic Union and the other parties, and definitely it will be part of the campaign. The Israeli public is extremely tuned to those issues, and we see an interesting process that local governments in Israel, local municipalities, different mayors across the country are taking a stand on those issues. For example, in my hometown of Ramat Gan, a former Likud member, the former Knesset member Carmel Shama Cohen, who grew up in the Likud party and became to be the mayor of the city of Ramat Gan next to Tel Aviv, he actually initiated municipal bus lines that are working on Shabbat. And I'm saying it because once the mayors across the country identify it as an important issue, it tells you something about the way the larger Israeli audience is addressing those issues. They are not the most critical topics to the future of Israel as a state, but you see that Israelis have serious concerns about their basic quality of life. Now, the interesting thing about the issue of Shabbat is that in many ways it reflects the disability of the ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel to maintain a pragmatic approach towards issues of religion and state. And this is the same thing that happened to us with the negotiations around the Western Wall. And I want to remind us all that the ultra-Orthodox parties were a quiet partner in the negotiation around the egalitarian plaza in the wall. And although they didn't publicly supported the agreement, they signaled to Prime Minister Netanyahu that they will not cause dramatic challenges or problems to him if he approves the agreement. And after the agreement was adopted by the government, because of the public pressure, inside the ultra-Orthodox community. And because of the growing role of the ultra-Orthodox media in Israel, the political leadership of the ultra-Orthodox communities had actually to push Netanyahu to freeze the agreement. And this is the same thing that is happening to us with Shabbat. The ultra-Orthodox politicians are being pushed to the corner by the more extreme forces in their own communities. There is a leadership crisis today inside the ultra-Orthodox Israeli world that creates many, many challenges to the political leadership of this community to reach quiet understandings. And I strongly believe that if the ultra-Orthodox parties are part of the next coalition, we will see the issue of Shabbat rises again and again every few months and creates a new political scandal and a new political challenge to the next Israeli Prime Minister, Netanyahu, or Benny Gantz. And I believe that the thing we saw recently in Ramat Gan, that more and more local governments are finding local solutions, this will be a growing trend today or in the coming few years in Israel. And this can be seen also as a general analysis in this arena of religion and state. We will see a growing role of the local municipalities that will find local solutions in order to deal with the fact that the national system of government cannot offer any good solutions.
Yeah, I think that's, as they say, all politics are local politics. And it seems like an interesting way to deal with the fact that the Israeli political system, in deference to the American political system, does not have a direct representative parliament in which people can vote for a local district, let's say, and be represented nationally. But you're saying that the local mayors, or in rural areas, the regional councils, will have a growing prominence, especially in dealing with some of those issues of public observance or traversing that territory around what should happen there. And that's fascinating. And I think from what you're saying also is that even if these issues like Shabbat and public observance and transportation aren't campaign issues, you're saying that they will definitely feature prominently in the coalition negotiations after the elections, when the parties vie for ideological stances and portfolios and different offices that they'll administer. I want to move on. I've seen some of the questions are excellent questions coming in, but they are political questions about the Democratic Union, which I appreciate, and I promise to get to them. I just want to stick on some of the issues of religion and state for a few minutes. Let's look at marriage, divorce, and conversion, and then we'll move on to the sort of the general broad trend that we're seeing that we call in Israel Hadata, or religiousification. I'll point out that in the last elections in 2015, in April, the last election, Gilad campaigned on a slogan of "Ken liyahadut lo lahadata," yes to Judaism, but no to, let's call it, religious coercion or religiousification in the public sphere. How are these things related, and how are we seeing these trends, sort of be amplified as we move towards the election? And if you can explain to us a little bit of the background in terms of how we should understand the conversion issues and issues of marriage and divorce, and how that will play out, what has been some of the legislature in the past few months. I just want to pause and recommend to our audience that this is enough material for an entire semester's academic course, okay, which I recommend everyone to study with Rabbi Kariv. But for now, we'll just get sort of the tip of the iceberg here in looking at these specific issues. So Gilad, let me turn it over to you.
So again, I'll try to keep my remarks short in order to have enough time to answer the audience questions. I will say the following. When it comes to the issue of conversion, our main challenge is to make sure that there is no Knesset legislation that ends a monopoly, a formal monopoly to the chief rabbinate over conversion. And that is because till today, not like in the area of marriage and divorce, there is no Knesset legislation that hands this monopoly to the chief rabbinate. And the result is that for many years now, the Supreme Court is backing our demand to impose full recognition of non-Orthodox conversions that are being held overseas, and also, in a way, in Israel, to impose the recognition of the state in those procedures. And because we are expecting another Supreme Court a ruling in regard to the validity of non-Orthodox conversions being performed inside Israel for people that are not Israeli citizens, we have a serious concern that if the ultra-Orthodox parties dominate the next coalition agreement, a new legislation in the area of conversion, a new version of who is a Jew legislation will be presented, and here we definitely need to work together. The leadership of the North American Jewish community and Israelis to prevent new legislation. If the ultra-Orthodox parties are not dominating the next coalition, then it will be the right moment to push the Supreme Court to release this important ruling. When it comes to marriage and divorce, here this is the opposite situation. Here we do have a Knesset legislation handing a full monopoly to the Orthodox establishment over marriage and divorce. And here we need to say that we need to work hard in order to enlarge this critical mass of Israelis that vote with their feet, and do not establish their families through the Orthodox recognized procedure. They live under a common law marriage, or they go overseas to enjoy the grace of foreign countries and have a civil marriage. And we need to cultivate this critical mass of Israelis that choose not to work with the Orthodox monopoly, and then to try to identify the right political movement to push the needle. And again, I'm not saying that this is the end result of this election, but we do have a possibility that a unity government will be formed, and that the role of the ultra-Orthodox parties in this unity government will be, they will play a smaller role than the one they played in the past. And this is an optional moment to push forward a reform in the Israeli domestic legislation, and we are preparing ourselves for this moment. I do want to say, and this is again important, we in the Reform and the conservative movement, we are deeply involved with those issues of conversion and civil marriage and divorce, and Jewish curriculum inside the public school system, and the lack of recognition to our rabbis and congregations. But I urge us all to remember that right now, when we are talking about the issue of religion and state, we are not only talking about those core issues that are part of our agenda for the last 72 years. I ask all of you to remember that right now, the debate over the authorities, the constitutional authorities of the Israeli Supreme Court, for example, are being presented in the shades of religion and state issues. the most vocal and aggressive forces who are trying to minimize the constitutional authorities of the Israeli Supreme Court are the modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox politicians. Okay? And the issue of religion and state today has a great impact on other core issues of our democratic mechanisms. There is today, and again, I present my political analysis, and I of course respect and welcome other analysis or political understandings, but from my perspective, there is today some kind of a political covenant between Prime Minister Netanyahu and those ultra-Orthodox politicians. Prime Minister Netanyahu has his own concerns with the law enforcement system in Israel, and the ultra-Orthodox parties are using those concerns in order to push back the Israeli Supreme Court, mainly because they identify this institution as the chaperone of progressive values, including the issue of freedom of religion, and the issue of the relations between the Jewish majority and the Arab minority in Israel. Today, this issue is dramatically influenced by religious rhetoric that was also the main foundation for the new basic law of the nation state, for example. Right? And when we are talking about religion and state in Israel, we need to understand that the nation state bill is part of our discussion. And the way we are talking today about the immigration policy in Israel, today Ayelet Shaked, the former Minister of Justice, and the leader of the new right-wing Orthodox or semi-Orthodox party, when she talked about the fact that Israel now is deporting children, mothers and children, back to the Philippines, in spite of the fact that the children were fully integrated in the Israeli public school system, one of leading justifications to this rough immigration policy is the need to protect the law of return. As if the fact that 1,000 mothers and children live among us, 7 million Jews in Israel, this will have an enormous effect on the law of return and the Jewish character of the state of Israel. And it's important, again, to remember that we are not only talking about the rights and the status of non-Orthodox communities in Israel. We are mainly talking about the core values of the state of Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state. And today it's all presented to the Israeli audience with a political vocabulary of the tension between religion and state.
Mm-hmm. But you're saying it touches at the very core of what it means to be a Jewish state. And I think if I could just add one more issue, talking about whether or not the ultra-Orthodox parties will have considerable influence or power over the next coalition, just say a word about the draft of the ultra-Orthodox to the army and maybe play a couple of scenarios. If the Haredi parties do make it into the coalition, what are the possibilities for that? And if they don't, how might the broader Haredi community react, and what should we watch for there in the coming weeks and months?
Look, here I need to say that I don't identify a real critical issue around this subject. It is quite clear that the Israeli army and the Israeli government do not want to be in a situation that they are imposing the military draft on tens of thousands of Haredi young adults in Israel. And the debate right now between Avigdor Lieberman and Yair Lapid and the ultra-Orthodox parties and leaders can basically be solved. The two sides are using this issue in order to make their point in the current campaign. I need to say that the way Avigdor Lieberman is playing the cards tells us that he is serious in his desire to form a government without the ultra-Orthodox parties. Right? He places himself in a public and political corner that will make it very difficult for him to change his attitude around the
Gilad, I think you
quite
actually.
serious
Yeah.
in creating a unity government without the ultra-Orthodox parties. Let me remind us all that we had this situation 15 years ago with the Shinui party. It's not that we didn't experience an Israeli government without the presence of the ultra-Orthodox parties. And again, it looks like that Avigdor Lieberman is trying to recreate this situation in a serious manner. Right now, according to the polls, he can impose such an end result to the elections, but everything can change till September 17th. I do want us all to keep in mind that Avigdor Lieberman is a very smart politician. And the fact that he identifies right now the issue of religion and state as the core issue of his campaign tells us something about the strategic shifts in the public views of the Russian-speaking community in Israel. Now, people don't always remember or realize that every fifth Israeli voter is a Russian-speaking Israeli. This is a huge community. It's a massive community. And Avigdor Lieberman in his campaign is telling us that something is shifting inside this community. And you mentioned, Josh, the way he uses the word liberal. And I can tell you that 3 years ago or 6 years ago, this word was not part of Avigdor Lieberman's vocabulary. Now, I'm not suggesting to trust Avigdor Lieberman as a politician. The truth is that he failed us again and again and again, and he presented some views and ideologies that we cannot embrace as progressive or reformed Jews in Israel in regard to the Arab minority, inside Israel, a future solution with the Palestinians, and other topics. But it tells you something about the potential that does exist inside the Russian-speaking community. And one of the things that the progressive camp in Israel must do is to address this audience in a much more serious manner. And I'm not talking only about political campaigns. I can tell you that our movement in Israel is investing many efforts in recent years in order to build congregations and studying programs that are targeting this audience of Russian-speaking Israelis. We need to see them, this community, as a strategic community in Israel and as a strategic investment to all of us.
Yeah, and just to clarify, you mean the Reform Movement, not the Democratic Union Party?
I think the Democratic Union should do it also, but
yeah.
I refer to the Reform Movement.
Speaking of which, in the few minutes that we have left, I just want to relate to some of the questions that have come in, which are, I would say, more political questions than religion and state-related questions, and I'll combine them together. Really the questions about who the Democratic Union, if it's made any decisions, will sit with in the coalition, whether they will join a coalition headed by Netanyahu, or whether there's a possibility, as Yair Golan recently stated, that there would be cooperation with the joint list of Arab parties, and where do you sit in those on those issues?
Well,
Question.
I find it difficult to see the Democratic Union joining a coalition led by Netanyahu. I think that the ideological gaps are too big, and I tend to believe that if Kahol Lavan joins a unity government led by Netanyahu, I tend to believe that the Democratic Union will lead the Israeli opposition, and this is an important role to play. And it's also an important position to use in order to build your future political capacities. And it's not only because of the personal legal issues that the prime minister is dealing with. I think, unfortunately, again, after a few years of a more progressive, inclusive policies that were presented by Prime Minister Netanyahu, he took a U-turn. I'm not in the position to suggest political analysis to the American situation, but definitely it had to do with the fact that President Trump came into office, and actually they built a very strong partnership. And Prime Minister Netanyahu in the last few years, and it was well reflected in the issue of the wall, but it was also well reflected in the lack of desire to renew any negotiations with the Palestinian Authority, and putting aside his statement about a two-state solution that was presented by him in the known Bar Ilan speech. Prime Minister Netanyahu took a U-turn and chose to go back to more hardcore positions, both in religion and state issues, in regard to the democratic mechanisms in Israel, and in regard to the Palestinians. And it will make it extremely difficult for the Democratic Union to join a coalition led by Netanyahu. There is a possibility that the left-wing parties will enjoy 61 mandates. It's not yet there in the polls, but the gap is not a huge gap, and things can happen in a 40-day campaign.
And that would include the joint list of Arab parties.
Yes. Now, in regard to the joint list of Arab parties, first it is important to say that for itself, the Democratic Union is based on the concept of Jewish-Arabic partnership. In the Democratic Union list, there are non-Jewish candidates, Muslim, from the Bedouin community, from the Druze community, inspiring public leaders. And it's important to say that the Arabic Knesset member of Meretz, Isawi Frege, played a central role in forming the Democratic Union by suggesting that Israeli Arabs can build political partnership with the former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who was the Prime Minister during what we called the October riots in the year of 2000, when 13 Israeli Arab citizens were killed by the police following violent demonstrations. And we need to
And which he subsequently apologized, issued a public apology.
Yes, he issued a public apology. It led the way to the Democratic Union. And there is a strong understanding inside the Democratic Union, as you can see also in the Labour Party, that this is the time to talk about a Jewish-Arab partnership. In regard to the joint list, unfortunately, the fact that extreme Arabic forces are part of this joint list, like Balad, it makes it more difficult to build a strong political alliance with this list. I do hope that we will be able to form strong political bonds with the moderated players in this joint Arabic list.
Good. Okay, we just have a couple minutes left. So, Gilad, if you can summarize it and answer in a minute or less, just one question pertaining to our audience is, where do you think American Jewish participation should be? And what's a message that you'd like to send to members of the Reform movement or activists with the Israel Policy Forum who are listening and who are following very closely the developments of leading up to the elections and are eager to be involved? And what's one thing that we should be taking away for our own communities here abroad? And I just want to mention that we do have listeners coming in from around the world to our international reform movement and other people who picked up the webinar, and we're glad that you're with us.
Okay. So, first of all, again, I want to thank the Israeli Policy Forum and the Union of Reform Judaism, and to you, my friend Rabbi Josh Weinberg, for initiating this conference called this webinar. We extremely, and here I'm talking as one of the leaders of the Israeli Reform Movement, but I allow myself also to speak as one of the candidates of the Democratic Union. We deeply appreciate our partnership. And I can tell you that, and it's not going to be a surprise for you, that progressive Israelis, liberal Israelis, Israelis that believe in strong and vibrant Israeli democracy, we feel under attack. And it's clearly the case with the Israelis that belong to the Reform and to the conservative movement. And knowing that in the end, there is a massive Jewish audience overseas that share the same values with us, this is a very important thing for us to carry, to present to the larger Israeli public. I encourage you, encourage all of us to remind our congregants, our friends, our colleagues in North America and other parts of the Jewish world that there is a huge Israeli audience that is fully committed to the core values of Israel's Declaration of Independence. There is a huge Israeli audience that is committed to the idea of a Jewish-Arabic shared society, which is committed to the renewal of the peace process, which is totally committed to the issue of freedom of religion and conscience in Israel. And this is not a lost battle. And I suggest that the failure of Prime Minister Netanyahu to build a right-wing ultra-Orthodox coalition and the role of our issues in the current campaign tell us all that there is, that our voice, that our values are relevant to the Israeli political scene, that we can create a major change. And here I want to encourage you to continue your involvement, your individual involvement and your communal involvement. And I do want to say that we are going to vote on September 17th. But during 6 weeks, between Martin Luther King Day and Hag Purim, next January, February, and the beginning of March.
I believe it's January 21st through March 11th.
North American Jews have the opportunity also to present their Zionist values and the way they see the future relations between Israel and the diasporic communities, to show and to present their commitment to progressive and democratic Zionism by voting to the Zionist Congress in the election to the World Zionist Organization. And I can tell you that it makes an impact. And I urge you all actually to meet our vote by making sure that your congregants, your friends and partners are also voting in the World Zionist Organization elections that will take place next winter, to vote in order to promote our values and our interests, both in Israel and in diaspora communities.
Okay, well, thank you so much for such a wealth and rich conversation. I know it's getting late in Israel, so I want to be conscious of the time. Toda, toda, toda. I want to turn it over to our partner, Evan Gottesman, who will summarize the call and let us know about the next one. Again, toda to Gilad, and thank you to the Israel Policy Forum.
Thank you. And again, I want to thank everyone who joined today, and to thank Rabbi Kari for sharing his expertise, and Rabbi Weinberg for moderating, and the Union for Reform Judaism for partnering in this series. My name is Evan Gottesman. I'm the Associate Director of Policy and Communications at Israel Policy Forum. I want to invite you all to come to the next installment in this elections webinar series, which will feature Arik Rudnitsky of the Israel Democracy Institute. And it's going to focus on the role of the Arab parties in Israeli politics, a question that came up in this very webinar today. And that program is going to take place on Thursday, August 22nd. I also want to encourage you, if you want to learn more about the elections, to follow Israel Policy Forum's 120 project at www.israelpolicyforum.org/elections2. That's the number 2. We've just uploaded summaries or profiles of each of the different political parties that are running in this election. Also on our podcast, Israel Policy Pod, we have an audio summary of all of those different political parties, and just different videos, resources, recordings of the webinars like this one. As was mentioned at the beginning of this, a recording of this webinar will be made available on our Israel Policy Forum website, and www.israelpolicyforum.org. You can also find it on our election site. So thank you again to everyone for joining, and we hope to see you all when we reconvene to talk about the Arab parties.
Thank you, friends.